Hello and welcome to this first part of a tutorial about how to create responsive websites. A responsive website is a website with a layout that will adjust to different screen resolutions. And it's really important to implement a responsive layout to your web pages today, because internet users will be accessing your site from smartphones and tablets and desktops and laptops, all with very different screen resolutions, and you want to ensure a good user experience for all. Here's a quick preview of the final product. It's a basic website with a layout in columns next to each other, but when we resize the web page, then the columns will be stacked on top of each other. We'll also be creating a button that will appear on small screens to toggle the appearance of the menu. And the whole project is going to be very slim and lightweight. We're not going to include any external libraries or frameworks. And if we take a look at the CSS, you can see that the entire style sheet is only taken up about 150 lines. I have created a folder for our project, and it's containing two subfolders. The first one is called content, and it just contains some text files with the dummy content that we're going to bring into the page. The second folder is for the images. We have a page banner image here, and we have a logo. We also have icons for the search button and for the menu toggle button. Now I'm creating two files, a CSS file that I will name style.css, and I'll just delete the default style rules here, and then I will create an index.html file. We have a doctype declaration here, which is fine, and the HTML tag with head and body elements. UTF-8 is fine, but we actually don't need a closing slash. A title is always important. We will also want to create a link to the style sheet. By the way, I'm using Microsoft Web Matrix, but you can of course be working with any text editor or IDE that you prefer. Now I'm going to paste a very important meta tag into the document head. You will need this meta tag and these values if you want to create a responsive website, because it will prevent the default zooming that happens on many handheld devices. So don't ever forget the viewport meta tag. Okay, now we can close off the head element. We don't need to work anymore on that. And let's take a look on how we can structure the actual visual elements on the page. I'll just paste some comments into our CSS file so we can organize the style rules a bit. The first set of style rules will be browser resets, and then some rules for our main blog elements, then for the navigation. Then we will set up some rules for typography, inputs and buttons, display classes I will get back to later. Unique elements will basically be elements we don't know where else to put. And down here we will have our media queries. Media queries are groups of style rules that will only be executed if certain conditions are true. And we can see the condition for the first media query is that the screen has to be minimum 720 pixels wide. To demonstrate how media queries work, I will add a black background to the HTML element, and down in the media query I will add a red background to the same element. And we can see in the browser now that whenever the window is wider than 720 pixels, then the background is changing. If I then remove the background color in the media query, then we can see that the initial black background will apply to all screen sizes. So your initial CSS will only get overwritten if a rule is specified in the media query. I'll just remove the black background again now, and then I'll start to set up the resets we need. First I want to set up some rules for all the elements, so I'm using the star wildcard selector. I want them all to have a box sizing property with a value of border box. This will ensure that borders or padding will not be added to the width or height of the elements. I'm also resetting the padding and the margin to 0, but I don't want to lose the list indentation, so I will override the padding for list elements and set their value back to initial. If we take a look at our final product, we can see that we have elements side by side, and I have chosen to do that by floating them. However, there is a slight problem with floated elements. The problem is that the parent element will not expand to fit the floated content unless we add a clearfix reset or clearfix hack. There are several clearfix hacks, but the version I have chosen to use is Niels Harbo's, because it also fixes some problem with the margins on the parent element. I will leave a link in the video description to Niels Harbo's full clearfix hack. The next reset here is just that I'm making sure that all HTML5 block elements is actually rendered as block elements. For most of these elements it shouldn't be necessary, but with the main element here, at least it's very important that you set it to display block, because Internet Explorer doesn't recognize this element, and unknown elements will by default be rendered as inline elements. The final reset is for images and SVG elements. I'm giving them a width and a max width of 100%. That way the images will fit to their parent elements and scale accordingly when the page is resized. The page that we are creating consists of 3 main areas or outer wrapper elements. We got the page top here with the header and navigation. Then we got the center of the page with the main content and the sidebar. And finally we have the bottom wrapper here containing the footer. In our index HTML we will create these 3 outer wrappers as div elements. The first one will have a class name called wrapper top. The second one we will call wrapper main, and the last one we will call wrapper bottom. The top wrapper contains a logo, a search form, and the main menu. For the logo we will create a div element in our HTML. We will also create a div for the search form, and for the main menu we will use a nav element. The next wrapper contains the page heading here and the image, and then the main article and the sidebar below. For the page heading and the banner image we will create a div, and for the main article we could create a div, but it would actually be better to have it in a main element. That way we are telling search engines that this area of the page contains the main and important content. Finally we will create the sidebar, and we will use a side element for that. In the last wrapper we will add a footer element, and for the purpose of this tutorial I have chosen to divide it into 3 columns. The footer will act like an inner wrapper that will be centered on the page, but we will need the same effect on the top of our page because our logo and search form is floating, and we would like those elements centered as well. So we will add a header here as an inner wrapper for those 2 elements. Now we have created the entire HTML template, and we can start to add some styles to it. First we will give our outer wrappers the correct colors. For our top and bottom wrapper we want a dark background, so I'm gonna give it a background property with a hex value of 333, and then I'll just add a white font color. We will also need to set some styles for the middle of the page with the main area, but we're not gonna target the main wrapper itself. Instead we're gonna let it inherit some values from the body element. So I will give the body element a white background and a dark font color. We will want the dark color of the footer to span to the bottom of the browser window. So we will just give our HTML element the same background color as the footer. All block elements are as default 100% white, and that is fine for smaller screens, but on wider screens we would like to limit the width of the elements and center them. So we're going to add a maximum width and a margin to our inner wrappers or inner elements. So now I'm just giving class names to our inner wrappers or inner elements that we want centered. We will give the header the class name page header. We will give the navigation the class name page navigation. The main wrapper is also going to be centered, but it already has a class name that we can use. And the footer we will give the class name page footer. Some of these inner wrappers are going to contain floating elements, so we will also give them the clearfix class name to make sure that the parent element expands to the floating content. So in our style sheet we will now set up the rules that will actually center these elements. The rules should apply to the page header class and the page navigation, the wrapper main and the page footer. The properties we're going to add is a max width of 1000 pixels and a margin left and right with a value of auto. If we refresh the browser window, we can see the margin take effect, but we still need to float the child elements, and we're going to do that by creating a simple grid system with some generic classes we can assign to the child elements. The first two floating elements will be the logo and the search form in the header. I would like each of these elements to take up half of the available width, so I will assign a class name of 1/2 to each of them. The main article on the page and the sidebar is also going to be floating, but I would like the article to take up 2/3 of the available width, so I'll give it a class name of 2/3, and the sidebar should take up the remaining third, so I will give it the class name 1/3. In the footer we have 3 floating elements, so we're going to assign the class name 1/3 to each of these elements. Earlier it was considered bad practice with these generic class names, and it was recommended that class names described the content, but in the last few years this attitude has changed simply because it will save you a lot of CSS work if you use generic classes like 1/2 or 1/3 and just assign those classes to your elements instead of having to set up properties for a lot of individual class names. To be consistent, I'm also adding a full width class, and I'm assigning the div with the page heading and the banner to this class. In our initial CSS, the only rules we will add to these elements are padding, and we will give them all a value of 1 relative m. Then I'm going to copy them all and paste them down to our first media query, and here we will assign the float properties to every element. The value of all the floats will be left, and we will also give them a width. For the 1/3 class we will of course give it a width of 33%, and for the 2/3 class we will give it a width of 66%, 1/2 will be 50%, and full width will of course be 100%. And it looks like all the elements are in place now, except for the search form, and it's just because I have forgotten the camel case notation here in the style sheet, so we will just fix that. Now all the main blocks are in place, and we can start to insert some real content instead of the placeholder text. In the logo div I will create an image tag and insert the logo here. I will also give it an alt attribute and a class name. The other div in the header should contain the search form. I will add a form tag and give it the class search form, It should also have a method attribute, and the method for search forms are usually get. Inside the form we will create two inputs. One is going to be a text input. It should have a name attribute. We'll call it search. The other input will be an image, and it will act like a submit button. And we're going to give it an alt attribute as well. When the browser window is very wide, we can see that the logo gets a little bit too big. So in our style sheet under unique elements, we will add some style rules for the logo class assigned to the image. And we will just give it a max width property with a value of 200 pixels. If we take a look at my original template, we can see that the search form aligns to the right when the screen is wide, and on narrow screens we have it centered. So we will just add a text align property to our form element and then align it to the center in our initial CSS, and we will align it to the right in our media query. The last element we will create in this part of the tutorial will be the main menu. Inside our navigation element I will create an unordered list and give it a class name menu items, and in the unordered list we will just create a bunch of list elements with links to the different pages. We can see that we need to do quite a bit of styling to the menu. First of all, we will need to add some padding, but I don't want that much padding in the button, so I'll give it one relative EM of padding like the other elements, except for the padding in the bottom, where I will give it 0. Next we will remove the bullets from the unordered list. We actually have a class name we can use, menu items. We will set the list style property to none. The links are a little bit too close to each other, which will make them hard to interact with on a touch screen. So we will increase the line height on the list elements, and we will also give it a border bottom to divide the links. Finally, we will target the link elements themselves, and we will change the font color to white. We will also remove the default underline by setting the text decoration to none. And I made a little mistake here. The hex value for white is of course FFF. Now the menu looks fine on narrow screens, but we will need to make a little adjustment for wider screens. The only element we will have to change in the media query is the list element. So I will just copy that and paste it in our first media query. And I will set a display property with the value of inline block. And now we can see the elements are side by side. We'll just need to separate the links a bit. So I will give them a margin right with a value of about 1.5 relative ems. Okay, this concludes the first part of this tutorial, which is good because I don't have much voice left. In the next part we will be touching up on the final details, and we will also be creating the toggle menu functionality. You will also get an explanation of why I have been using relative ems for most fixed values. So thank you for watching this part, and stay tuned for the upcoming episode.